Welcome, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our third keynote session sponsored by Gowling's WLG. The keynote, this session will focus on IP and innovation, harnessing IP to enable innovation. As a reminder, in this session and others through the conference, we encourage you to engage in the chat or post questions in the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring that through this session. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers, Brian Kingwell, Partner, Patent and Trademark Agent at Gowling WLG, and Matilda Davidson, a Legal Director at Gowling, who is joining us from the UK. So good evening, Matilda. Good morning, Brian. Thank you very much for joining us. I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about a reflection about the pandemic and how in so many areas, whether it be the speed of innovation, the speed in which capital was flowing, the types of deals people were making, or emergency use authorization that really enabled innovation to come to market faster. How did the pandemic affect IP processes, deals, registrations? Brian, maybe you can take that first.
Sure. Well, speed certainly changed, but to draw on it, the wheels stayed on. The infrastructure, the legal context within which intellectual property is handled didn't change much, if at all. The bus did fill up with a lot of new ideas and did start traveling at speeds it hadn't traveled before. So it's been a very busy time. But as I said, the wheels stayed on. There were some initial legislation in a variety of jurisdictions, including Canada, that permitted the use of intellectual property in what is essentially amounted to emergency circumstances. It's not actually in Canada that different than our usual legislation that governs what's sometimes called abuse of patents. If patents are a barrier to the use of technology, then there are march-in rights. And so those laws did get passed in a variety of jurisdictions at the outset of the pandemic, but that's not what kept the wheels on. Those laws were not, the countries did not avail themselves of those new legislative tools in order to arrive at or facilitate the solutions that have seen us hopefully now most of the way through the pandemic. What really underpinned the structure that kept the intellectual property deals flowing was people's familiarity with that overarching structure and the legal framework in which deals are made, and their willingness to rely on that, the consistency of that framework to underpin the deals that are evident just in the names of the products that saved us. Pfizer BioNTech, Astra, Oxford, all of the products bear the evidence of the cooperative efforts that have been facilitated, and I think it's fair to say facilitated in large part by people's familiarity with the rules that are going to govern their legal interactions. And it's been heartening to see. It has been a little frustrating to sometimes see that biotech and big pharma and the patent system having come together to, in my eyes, offer a pretty remarkable solution to a pretty dramatic problem. There's been less celebration of that than I would have hoped, but I'm certainly celebrating. So that's sort of the framework.
And maybe, Matilda, I'm going to jump across the pond, so to speak, and ask you to talk a little bit about AstraZeneca, the Oxford innovation, because I believe it was handled a little bit differently in the selling at cost and how the tech transfer happened. Can you maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah, of course, Wendy. So yes, the Gowling UK team assisted on the partnering deal between the University of Oxford and AstraZeneca in the kind of early days of the pandemic. It was led by Patrick Duxbury, our head of life sciences, and also Jenny Davis, another partner in the IP team, life sciences team here. And I guess what was very interesting about the deal is that there was a very significant kind of commitment around trying to secure broad and equitable access across the globe to the vaccine that was going to be commercialized. And I think that was there sort of right from the start, both in the way that the deal was structured and in terms of the approach that AstraZeneca kind of took in sort of saying that they were prepared to accept a kind of a cost-based pricing structure. And it was very noticeable that very soon after, the ink was dry, there was a very significant technology transfer to the Serum Institute in India, which is obviously a very significant global manufacturer of vaccines. And that was specifically with a view to enabling access to the vaccine for low and middle income countries. The AstraZeneca team also entered into some quite significant deals with Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and also the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, again, to really kind of drive that attempt to secure global access.
Which is extraordinary. And it sounds like that was driven by both parties, both Oxford
Yes.
and AstraZeneca. And so in that situation, the vaccine was mostly developed through Oxford, if I understand, and then AstraZeneca was able to bring in the let's commercialize it, let's scale it with their manufacturing capabilities and other capabilities, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the University of Oxford it's an academic institution. It does not have a pharmaceutical kind of commercialization distribution arm. So yeah, they needed a partner. And as Brian was saying, it was they teamed up because that was the best way to kind of move things forwards.
So that leads us, it's a nice segue into a topic that has garnered lots of attention around the globe, certainly in Canada. And it's the question that, was really popping up around, should the vaccine producers be required to hand over their IP, or as I often refer to, recipe, in order to advance, the production of vaccines. And, there's been many countries that have taken different sides. The World Health Organization has had an opinion. And maybe you could share with us, both of you, maybe pick a side on the pros of it and the cons of it. So
you're asking too much.
Who wants?
There's only one side I can be on.
So maybe who wants to talk about the pros of why people have said this is a good idea, other than just expanding access?
Well, I'm a lawyer, so I'm allowed to speak on both sides, I believe. Yes. And I'll let Matilda, of course, do the same. The impetus obviously was driven by. This is not making my case very strongly, but it's not. But it's not the case I want to make. But by a variety of misapprehensions about what was holding up vaccine access, I think, and a variety of misapprehensions about the nature of intellectual property. And so, as you say, there was a certain amount of discussion about recipes, and if only we had the recipes in hand. And as a patent person, I was watching the debate taking place unusually in the popular press in Canada, and thinking, the recipes are there. That's what the patents are. They are the recipes. They're enabling by definition. There are, of course, a bunch of challenges to making billions of doses, but the recipes are there. And it was discussed as a patent waiver. So again, if you imagine that patents are the barrier, waiver kind of made sense. It made it sound as though what was being waived were all of the rights in a patent, and that was the barrier. That what was really being talked about The international framework for intellectual property permits the compulsory licensing of technologies. So the TRIPS permits that. And that was the basis upon which Canada introduced the legislation at the beginning of the pandemic permitting compulsory licensing. What was being waived was the obligation to pay reasonable compensation to the holders of intellectual property. And there wasn't much discussion about what that reasonable compensation might have been, for example, especially in the context of an environment in which many of the people who were bringing the vaccines to market were doing so at cost. So you need to ask yourself, what would reasonable compensation have even looked like in that circumstance? But it's not a waiver of anything but the obligation to pay the people who invented the things that are saving the world some reasonable compensation. So, in the intellectual property world, what we have is it amounts to what's called in the United States eminent domain. There is a right on behalf of public authorities to expropriate intellectual property, but in the case of the TRIPS agreement, or in the case of real property in the United States, the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution requires reasonable compensation. So that was what was being talked about as being the barrier being the need to pay reasonable compensation to intellectual property rights holders, which to my mind seemed like maybe the least of our problems. But I'm not making the case that you've asked me to make as
no, but I think what was interesting, and you raised it, it started to get into mainstream media, an issue that is complex, at the very at the very surface level, and so maybe, and Matilda, you could take this a little bit. So what Brian's talked about, the patent actually does give a little bit of the recipe, and it does, but it doesn't. But what would be the challenges? Like, so if one of the vaccine manufacturers and said, okay, here you go crazy. What are the challenges that also resulted in that? Because I think it got misinterpreted a little bit about a reluctance of patent holders to give up recipes as opposed to the logistical challenges, even if that had happened.
Yeah, Wendy, I would agree. I very much agree with the sort of the thought behind your question. I should maybe actually disclose as part of the discussion, I worked for Oxfam for a period of time, who obviously have a position on this.
I should have given you the first question.
Yeah. So I probably
both.
I probably start from a place of sympathy with the objective, but kind of as an IP professional for over 14 years now, who works on a lot of these types of transactions, I kind of have some serious questions about the means and the practicality. And actually, for me, there are some very, very big practical points, even if the waiver were secured, or even if it were the right thing to do. And I guess a lot of that is actually around two things: actual manufacturing capacity, just literally, facilities in the world that can do this. And also the fact that the products we're talking about they're complex products, and they're complex both in terms of their supply chain, and they're complex in terms of securing an appropriate yield. This point about the recipe, like, yes, it's in the patent, but also there's a massive amount of manufacturing technology and know-how. And the only way that in practice people get their hands on that is some kind of voluntary licensing arrangement of the type that happened when the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was technology transferred to the Serum Institute. So I think there are these very big unresolved practical questions as well.
Mm-hmm. And so would you say the transfer that AstraZeneca did to the institute in India, did that Was that successful, and did it bring both the recipe and the know-how?
Well, I mean, that's, that when you enter into these kind of agreements, that's kind of, they're enabling in that way. So, yes, you've got the kind of the rights sewn up, but you also have the practical transfer.
Right.
And of course, the Serum Institute has manufactured, I suspect, many billions of doses.
I think it remains the largest manufacturer in the world.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We have a question that says, what are the takeaways from the pandemic an IP professional needs to consider in the future?
Well, an IP professional, what I've taken away from it is that what I think, judging perhaps a little bit from your previous conversation with a local Canadian politician, that the world needs more and better drugs. And there is a lack of capacity to meet many of our medical challenges. And the pandemic highlighted many of the weak points in our system. And we, I think, now have an opportunity, as the pandemic hopefully draws to something like a close, to address those. And I'm hopeful that the lessons aren't forgotten, that the sticking points are remembered, and people turn now to addressing those.
Matilda, do you have any takeaways from the pandemic as an IT professional? I mean, you've sat in a very unique situation on some of the things you've worked on.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, the really big point is what can be done at speed, where there is will, and, well, let's be honest, money as well. It is quite extraordinary if you kind of step back and think that, back March 2020, there were various discussions going on about whether a vaccine was possible at all, whether COVID-19 was actually just not vaccinable. And yet here we are under 2 years later, and a lot of people worldwide have been given a shot. Not enough people yet, but a lot of people have had a vaccine. We're beginning to see some therapeutics in use, hopefully more, and that commitment to securing those things is it's quite amazing to kind of to take that forward in terms of what can be done with the application and the cooperation.
Mm-hmm. Well, and interesting, in my previous conversation with Minister Callan, he actually referenced the collaboration within what he feels is very unique within our sector, and that many of our leaders look beyond just their personal interests or what they're doing to the broader, what role can the ecosystem play.
I do have to give the UK credit here, not just because Matilda's around, but it did seem that the UK, which has a fully national sort of approach to many aspects of clinical trials, often seem to be doing a better job of moving quickly to evaluate, for example, potential therapeutics in quick clinical trials with quick results. Canada, by nature, with our federation, has a variety of healthcare systems that are not as coordinated as the national system in the UK, and it did seem that at times that was problematic for Canada.
We had Sir John Bell, speak at one of our conferences last year, and had him take us through the life sciences strategy that the UK has. And I know there's been life sciences 2.0, which we're hoping to have him back for. And I would agree with what you're saying, Brian. One of the things that does stand out is that national focus. And I think also that really stronger collaboration between academia, and especially as you spin out in the clinical trials approach and being able to manufacture for clinical trials, that closer collaboration with some of the larger pharma companies and academia seems to also be a feature in that. Matilda, what's your perspective? I don't know how much you know about the Canadian system, but the UK really does seem to have a very purposeful life sciences strategy.
Yeah, I won't speak to the Canada situation because I wouldn't claim to know very much about it, I'm afraid. But yeah, the UK strategy does seem to be quite strong. I mean, of course, we do have some questions to answer as we, our sort of process of exiting the European Union evolves, and we kind of work out what the kind of the future for UK science exactly is. But in terms of the kind of the current situation, it does seem very healthy. And as you say, there is very close working between academia and industry, and actually other funders as well. So a few years ago, I spent some time on secondment at Cancer Research UK, which is, as the name probably suggests, a very significant funder of oncology research in the UK. And it's a very connected ecosystem, with kind of academics, research groups, working with funders and with industry, a whole plethora of spin outs, of course, but then also looking internationally to kind of pull in the best expertise and to partner in the best way. So it is quite an exciting environment.
It is an exciting environment, and we certainly see a lot of that collaboration in British Columbia, and I know many people would like to see it elevated, and but we have certainly numerous examples of it. Brian, you and I had a discussion recently about who's holding these patents, and that there's often a perception that they're all held by big pharma, which I think took us back to our previous conversation. But could you take us through the path as, in research academic institutions, somebody finds something that they believe they need a patent for, and where are those patents held, and what's the process as they come to commercialization?
Yeah, that was a striking lesson of the pandemic. And as you say, when it hit the popular press, it was often discussed as though the patent waivers applied to patents that were held by big pharma. But by and large, that isn't the case. As the local British Columbia life sciences sector knows better than almost anybody else, the legacy of intellectual property that went into the vaccines goes back a very long time through chains of academic and small corporate innovators, and arrives ultimately at a deal with large manufacturing capability with big pharma, so that in fact many of the intellectual property claims to aspects of the vaccines are held by relatively small organizations, small compared to big pharma. And that's I've always, it's been a fascinating thing for me about the local BC life sciences ecosystem, is that it has thrived in the absence of a big pharma in Canada. Really, there is clearly a sustainable portion of the capital markets that's enthusiastic about the degree of risk and return that small to medium-sized life sciences companies can offer, and all of which is undertaken in the expectation not that they'll be turning into multinational drug companies, but they will be able to make deals to bring their products to market. And those deals are, of course, all underpinned by intellectual property. So it's there is a web of it, but the web doesn't interfere with innovation. It holds it all together and facilitates it. And I think the pandemic illustrated that perfectly.
We opened our conference yesterday with David List from NRC, NRC is turning 75 this year. Matilda, NRC is our National Research Council, big funder of, especially as it relates to our sector, SMEs, as they are scaling out their innovation. And he suggested that the pace of company creation, or the case of the amount of the number of companies that they're supporting, is growing exponentially. And just interested, are you seeing that too? So as we pull out of the pandemic, are you seeing a rapid increase in patent and intellectual property discovery, or are you seeing that it somewhat got paused because everything turned to the pandemic?
Yeah, very, very, very interesting. I mean, early in the pandemic, so I haven't got the sort of the data at my fingertips, Wendy, but anecdotally, at the beginning of the pandemic, there were programs that were paused, and something that I am aware of having been a problem and continuing to be a problem is actually the progress of clinical trials. So, obviously, further down the line than the sort of the creation of IP and the filing, but still a central step to getting products to market. So, and I also know that some funders were sort of third sector funders were experiencing and expecting further sort of squeezes on funding. Whether that has certainly the deals have not slowed down. So I don't know what time will tell, basically what the impact of that is, but I know that on the sort of both on the fundamental research side, but then also on the clinical trial side, there were some issues early on, and there continue to be some issues on clinical trials.
So. Brian, any closing remarks on that topic?
Well, to return back to where we started, in a way, I think that a big part of the lesson is that their intellectual property has an important role in holding the sector together and facilitating deals, and that we have learned through the pandemic that there are lots of problems that remain to be solved, and those are amenable to solutions through cooperation and deal making. And Matilda and I and other lawyers are looking very much forward to being a very small part of solving some very big problems in a collegial cooperative sector. And I think it's important for us to celebrate all of the achievements that have clearly helped to bring the pandemic to end in a remarkable fashion. And
well, and I think if I take it back to BC, we are blessed with world-class academic and research institutions that are making discoveries every day that are hugely impactful, both today and will be impactful as we launch, as we continue to bring this innovation into our healthcare system and beyond. So thank you for the discussion and the dialogue, and for what you do to help advance innovation.
Likewise, Wendy, thank you for having us, and thank you for what you do for the whole sector.
Thanks.
It's exciting.
Bye.